My name is Seraphina, the Masked Lady. I was once human. Since then, I have lived many lives. I have been loved and reviled, adored and despised, been the child of a poor prostitute and a courtesan revered by thousands. When I was a child, a stranger with no face offered me the ability to move between the worlds. Since then, my every death has led to a new life. I once had a true love. He was ripped away from me when I was murdered in the 18th century. I search for him still. In the meantime, I walk in the shadows behind the universe, visiting realms both exquisite and terrible and bringing back stories and rhymes to amaze the mind and enchant the ear. Through my YouTube channel, I send the stories out into the world, hoping that my true love will hear them and reply. Hoping, if he does not, that I will find in the other souls who listen kindred spirits to help ease the pain. What of you, stranger? Did you come here tonight seeking a mystery? Do you hunger for a spark of excitement, for the dark thrill of fear? Will you listen as my tales unfold, knowing that some may very well take on lives of their own? Consider, stranger, whether you have the courage to walk between the worlds with Seraphina, the Masked Lady. Hello there, my delicious December darlings, and festive hugs to you all. I am so happy to be speaking to you today. It is now less than a week until my favorite day of the year. Yes, it's Christmas. You might think, after hundreds of years and many different bodies and lives, I would be jaded about the magic of Christmas. But it happens to be one thing in which I am a true believer. In my first family, business would stop on Christmas Day and Boxing Day, and all the ladies would pitch in to buy a feast that would have shamed the Lord Mayor's kitchen. We would exchange gifts, most of them handmade, and every sad and scary thing that had happened during the year was totally forgotten. Those were the happiest days of my young life, and I treasure them even now. Given what is happening in the world, it might seem difficult or even wrong to celebrate. But I can tell you this: mortal lives are short, and every precious moment of joy and celebration needs to be grabbed with both hands. The character in the following story had a sister who understood the importance of joy, but a sad event has stolen her Christmas spirit. Join us as we find out if she can recapture it again. The Wish. Chapter 1. When death comes, it often comes softly, on booted feet, as if half ashamed of what it takes from us. In the moment between one heartbeat and the next, it can invade a home, steal the life from a loved one's lips, and depart. In films, death is always something else. It is noble, dramatic, or tragic. In life, it means only one thing: the aching void of loss. Chapter 2. It was cold, too cold for a 14-year-old girl to be dressed in cut-off shorts and a thin t-shirt, but Jane barely noticed the temperature. Jane was alone, perched in the branches of an oak, arms stretched disconsolately over her knees. Her diminutive figure would have drawn sympathy from anyone, had anyone been present to see her. It was nearly midday, but beneath the current cloud cover, the space between the trees was almost dark. Once, Jane had loved the light. Now, she relished the darkness, especially as she was crying. When Jane cried, it was difficult to see. She was what most people called strong. As far as the outside world was concerned, nothing touched her. She was calm and self-possessed, mature, as she sat staring out across the barren expanse of mud beneath her, listening to silence. The tears on her face seemed to be the only soft things about her. She looked dry, hard, empty. Inside, she was dying. It was the morning of Christmas Eve day. Across the small town of Shaftesbury, the 2,015 inhabitants were preparing to celebrate the holiday season, wrapping presents, pulling crackers, and indulging in short quarrels that faded quickly into a general haze of merrymaking. Her friends would be standing beneath the mistletoe outside Joe Barker's grocer's, their eyes fixed firmly on the huddle of boys on the other side of the pedestrian walkway, the boys who had transformed the abandoned post office into a skating park would be attempting stunts, swearing with the guilty pleasure of adventurous 10-year-olds and hoping that girls would notice them. Each girl, in turn, would have her eyes fixed upon her favorite skater, praying, with a kind of breathless apprehension, that he would eventually look their way. A year ago, Jane would have been with them. She would have stood there, wrapped in her winter best, waiting for Matthew Sarin to finish his run. She would have been thinking about the weekend and Gail Roberts' sleepover, and the excitement of the build-up to the Christmas dance. Now, nothing seemed less important. Of course, being here wasn't exactly a barrel of laughs either. Although Jane had long ago stopped feeling the cold, the branch beneath her was thin, biting into the tops of her calves like a hungry predator. She was hungry, and the cramps in her stomach were becoming more insistent. Worse, a low but persistent pressure in her bladder was telling her that she needed to pee soon. That was the problem. Jane had no qualms about pissing in the woods. Heck, bears did it all the time, but current temperatures made that inadvisable. Aside from the danger of perverts and the looming threat of poison ivy, exposing one's posterior to the air in the late days of December was guaranteed to bring on a chill of epic proportions. The thought of another visit to Dr. Faulkner, he of the nasal hair, and the odd, mildewy smell was enough to lend some iron to her bladder. She would wait. "Oh no, you won't," her bladder responded. A ripple passed through the muscles of her abdomen. She felt them pulling tight and opening simultaneously, caught between necessity and her will. "Stay put," Jane told the urine. "I'm in control here." The ripple began again, this time with a cramp that bit deep into the base of her back. She clamped her legs together as she felt something begin to trickle, appalled at the idea that she was going to lose control. "And then what?" she asked herself. "Walk through town with a pee stain on my shorts. What else will you do?" her body seemed to demand. "Okay," Jane thought fiercely. "I'll just sit here and wet myself. I did it in infant school. I can do it again." There were no other alternatives open to her. She couldn't go back. Her house on Church Street had a commode, an ensuite, and all the apple-scented air freshener a girl could want. It also had ghosts. 3 of them. One had an excuse. Jane's big sister had walked down one residential road too many and was now without a heartbeat. The others, however, had chosen their fate. Her mother and father were out now paying their respects. In their absence, the house was not even a shell. It was not a home. It was just a place, 4 brick walls and a chimney stack where something had once lived. It had been 2 weeks since the accident. In that space of time, Jane had aged years. It was a cliché, but it was true. The girl who had once hurried down the road, breathless with anticipation of the magic that lies in tinsel and gleaming tree lights, was gone. In her place was a stranger who had no memory of joy. Jane's house was decorated for Christmas. They had done it early, just before the accident. The tree was up, the silver was out, and the house bore all the trappings of a celebration. Jane had always loved their Christmas decorations. Now, they felt like blasphemy. Besides, no one was home. Her big sister's funeral would take another hour at least. Ginny and funeral should never have been words associated with each other. No one understood exactly what had happened. Ginny had been on the way to visit a friend when it happened. She had set out for home at 11 o'clock, climbing off the last bus at exactly 11:14. It should have taken her 5 minutes to walk down the main road and round the corner into the quiet, middle-class suburb where they lived. Instead, somewhere on that short stretch of pavement, she had walked into the path of Ronald Mather's car. Ron had been drunk and speeding. His brakes had reacted slowly. Ginny's watch had stopped at the moment of impact. 11:15. By the time Ron had screeched to a halt, Ginny had been lying lifeless on the road. Ron had been too shocked or too drunk to attempt escape. He had climbed out of the car and sat down next to Ginny's quickly cooling body, rocking and rocking like a man who'd lost his mind. A neighbor had called the police and an ambulance. By the time they arrived, all the medics could do was provide a time of death. According to her parents' lawyers, Ron was looking at a 5 to 10 year stretch in prison. It wasn't nearly enough. Chapter 3. Jasper. The sound erupted from the green lawn beyond her. Jane glanced towards it. A woman in a blue jumper was bouncing across the grass. She was throwing a frisbee for a large golden retriever. Through the interlocking branches that separated them, the figures were barely visible. A flash of azure, a blur of living gold. The dog barked happily, and its owner laughed, her voice sounding young even though she was much older than Jane, maybe as old as 20. Their voices made the silence around her seem more significant. Even the birds had stopped singing now. The place was dead. Suddenly, Jane had to move. She couldn't be there anymore. If someone had asked her if she was courting death, Jane would have looked at them incredulously. Still, as she made her way down through the tangle of limbs, she moved with a reckless abandon that could be successfully sustained only by suicidal stunt drivers and weeping teenage girls. Tree limbs bent and groaned. Branches sagged beneath her feet. They never broke. Still, although the appalling need to pee had mercifully retreated by the time Jane hit the ground, her body felt as brittle as glass. She wound her way along the familiar woodland paths, along the summit of a dusty 35-foot cliff that threatened broken bones to every child who scaled it, and back along the more visible footpath onto the common. It was empty. The woman and dog were gone. In the distance, crisp packets stirred in the wind, their colors bright against the sallow day. It looked, she thought, as if the drab, deciduous trees envied their longer-lived cousins and, unable to secure decorations of their own, sought to manufacture them from the available detritus. Jane had set her feet towards the second opening in the bushes, hoping the garage on the main road would let her use its bathroom, when someone spoke behind her. "Hey, Jane." Jane froze where she was, shoulders rising, tension drawing her vertebrae so tight that her neck began to ache. She didn't have to turn around to see who was speaking. "Jane," the voice repeated. Jane would have known it anywhere. She started to walk. Not today. Jane sent the plea into the universe. Jane knew at once that she was being followed. She wanted to run. The old queasy feeling was there in her stomach, the tightness in her chest. Her heart was pounding hard enough to make her feel dizzy. Her big sister had been right about one thing. Fleeing did no good. If you ran from bullies, you would always be running. As if in response to the thought, a booted foot hit Jane square in the rear. The pain bit deep. Jane turned. Despite her anger, her stomach sank at what she saw. The kicker was Belinda Ryan. "Jane, that's my name, don't wear it out," Jane thought. Jane's mental comebacks weren't great, but they strengthened her. "Hey," the bully continued. "Yeah, what?" Jane thought. "I'm talking to you." "I hadn't guessed," Jane thought. "What are you doing here anyway?" "I thought someone you know was getting planted today." "I'm computing the lard-to-bone ratio in your fat ass," Jane thought. "I'm waiting," Belinda said. "No, scratch that. We would need a NASA computer," Jane thought. Belinda was at least a foot taller and several inches larger than all the other girls in their year, and she used that advantage for all she was worth. There wasn't a girl in their class who hadn't borne the bully's wrath. Belinda's stomach hung over the belt of her jeans, her stretch marks clustered there, peeping out under a top 3 sizes too small. Under the pink demarcations, her skin was white. When she moved, the ripple reminded Jane of wriggling maggots. "You're being rude. I don't like it," Belinda said. Belinda had started circling Jane. Her bleached blonde hair stuck out from her scalp like extensions done by the Bride of Frankenstein. The sight was almost amusing. When Belinda pressed her hands to her jiggling hips like a sumo wrestler preparing for battle, Jane was forced to hide a smirk. "Got any cigarettes?" Belinda asked. Jane was silent. "Cash?" Belinda asked. Jane assumed her most disinterested expression. "Come on, after what's just happened, your parents must be spoiling you rotten." "What, are you too stingy to share?" Belinda asked. "No." I was just worried about your waistband. It's under enough pressure as it is, Jane said. Belinda halted, stunned by the retort. She couldn't have been more surprised than Jane. She might spark with wit in her private thoughts, but previously, they had stayed just that way. Private. She hadn't meant to speak out loud, Jane was almost sure of that. Yet, beneath her sudden terror, striking back had felt almost good. Belinda balled her fist. Lex's cheeks contracted around narrow eyes. I'll let that one go if you make with the cash. Now, I have places to go, Belinda said. Don't worry, McDonald's is open till 10. Jane retorted. Belinda snorted. Your sister never gave me this much trouble. Shame you haven't got her sense. Belinda sneered. Fuck you. Jane turned to go. Belinda swiped at her with one meaty paw barely connecting. Jane ignored her. She would not exalt violence by responding to it in kind. Hey! Jane ignored Belinda's squawk of protest. Footsteps sounded behind her. Another dull impact flared on Jane's body. Belinda had kicked her again. Jane's temper snapped. Perhaps it was Ginny. Maybe it was the 3 years of sly torment that Belinda had bestowed on her. Or perhaps, just perhaps, she wanted the bully to hit her, needed the hurt to revive her shriveling heart. Whatever the cause, Jane turned. She saw her fist flashing through the air like a comet, crashing straight into the bully's nose. A resounding crack split the day. The appendage was suddenly flattened against Belinda's cheek. Jane guessed she had broken the bully's nose, but she didn't hang around to find out. Chapter 4. Santa sat in the sheltered corner between the supermarket and the multi-story car park. When Jane noticed him, he was taking small, desultory sips from a cracked beer bottle. His change bucket, which, when she'd passed him earlier, he had been jingling enthusiastically, was abandoned at his side. His coat, the polyester, wet and stained, was open slightly, revealing a 5 o'clock shadow that had arrived 50 minutes ahead of schedule. The sight of him gave Jane pause. Not because drunken Santas were unusual in her neighborhood, sadly rather the reverse. Nor because she felt particularly sorry for him. His shoes were Doc Martens, far too expensive for someone who couldn't afford a hostel. It was, instead, that no one seemed to notice him. At first, Jane thought she was imagining it. She stopped to check, and the oddity became even more apparent. Shoppers swathed and bundled against the chill suddenly realized they had to check the time. Women adjusted their handbags. Men paused to dial numbers on their mobile phones or inclined their heads to whisper a tantalizing secret to their friends. As if by silent consent, they passed over and around the Santa, a tide of moving humanity scrubbing him out of existence by dint of their indifference. Because of that, Jane finally stopped to talk to him. Hi. She squatted down in front of the man. Hello, he said, cold out. The man nodded. It was odd, Jane thought. He didn't smell homeless. The familiar musty odor, a hallmark of too many nights spent in shop doorways and on park benches, was missing from his clothes, and his breath carried, of all things, the scent of cinnamon. So, do you want to sit on my lap? He asked. That's original, she thought. No, thanks, Jane said out loud. A bitter smile crept across his face. So, you gonna tell me what you want for Christmas? He inquired. My sister. The thought slipped past Jane's defenses before she could head it off. What she said out loud was very funny. The man let out an annoyed sigh. Look, kid, don't you have a home to go to? No. How about you? Jane retorted. The Santa stuck out his tongue. His company was fast losing its attraction. Jane nodded to the charity magazines in his red bag. How much? £1.20. She felt in the back pocket of her jeans. Nothing. She tried the right side. Her fingers discovered a crumpled £5 note. It was all she had. Do you have change? She asked. He shook his head. Not a penny. Jane's hand clasped convulsively around the note, then released. What the hell? She thought. It was Christmas. She couldn't be happy. She might as well do something to help someone else. Here, she pressed the note into the pot. Then, overcome by sudden embarrassment, she snatched the magazine from the Santa's extended hand and left. Chapter 5. Later, in her bedroom, having grown tired of sitting on the couch and ignoring her silent parents, Jane discovered the brooch. The Santa must have pinned it to her sweater when she'd leaned forward to give him the $5. Jane had spent most of the evening sitting in her tiny window seat, staring out at the garden and its one old apple tree, thinking about her sister. Ginny had driven her crazy. They'd been like chalk and cheese, dark and light. Dumb and dumber, Jane thought. Ginny and Jane had spent their early years at each other's throats, screaming, fighting, tormenting one another until their parents had despaired of ever seeing peace again. Then, at some indefinable stage between the ages of 8 and 10, the sisters had become aware of what everyone else had known since their infancy. Ginny had realized that her sister was not precisely the spawn of Satan, and Jane, she had started to understand that the embarrassment of having an older sister might be balanced by the possible increase in birthday presents. By the time they'd hit their teens, the arguments had not faded completely, but they had changed, becoming joking. Most evenings crawling home from an underpaid restaurant job and into an oversized nightdress, Ginny had come into Jane's room to talk. She had walked in smelling of old grease and beef burgers, curled up in the overstuffed armchair, hugged a cushion to her chest, and they talked. The stuff that Ginny said had rarely mattered. Shop gossip, college news, future dreams, hardly riveting. Still, there had been an odd comfort to it. Tonight, knowing that she would never watch Ginny pad into the room again, had driven Jane deeper into melancholy and finally into tears. Jane might never have seen the brooch if she hadn't sought refuge in sleep. The tiny pin that held the trinket had worked loose, and when she flung herself onto the bed, it had pierced her skin. Stung. She had brushed the area, expecting to dislodge a spider. Instead, she'd retrieved a tiny circle of gold. It was ancient. Jane was no historian, but she had visited a few museums and knew old when she saw it. The brooch reeked of history. It belonged somewhere where it could be hidden under glass. Instead, it was here with her. How on earth had a homeless man come to possess it? It had to be worth money. And why, if he had gained it, would he not sell it and instead cast it off on a strange teenage girl? Sitting up, Jane turned on her bedside light. The thing glistened. The brooch was inscribed. The image was buried beneath a sheath of dirt. Still, by scrubbing her finger repeatedly across the tarnished surface, Jane revealed the figure of a bearded man, his head encircled by a wreath of holly. The detail appeared moments later. Whiskers, full and growing, curled about the man's mouth. And the eyes of the engraving burned with a steady, enduring fire, glowing with a life of their own. She turned it over. At first, it looked like she had hit a dead end. Then her eyes caught something engraved on the bottom curvature. It was a word. No, to. Request received. Chapter 6. The light woke her at midnight. When Jane opened her eyes, rolling away from the stuffed bear that had somehow found its way beneath her cheek, she almost wished she hadn't. Her first hangover was just 6 months distant, and Jane could still remember it clearly enough to know that it had not even come close to this. She must have caught a cold while out in the trees. Her head felt heavy and tight, like an old skin drum. The skin beneath her eyes had swollen, blurring her sight. After a moment, Jane realized the light was coming in at a slant. That meant it had to be coming from the hallway. "Mum, the light's on," Jane called out. The light switch was set on the wall just outside her parents' bedroom, across 10 feet of fraying carpet. If the light was on, it meant that her mum had been to the toilet at least once tonight. As usual, her getting up would have woken Jane's dad. Her parents would be having another of their oh-so-tactful whispered conversations, huddled together in their sagging double bed. One of them could flick the switch. Jane closed her eyes and waited. Nothing happened. She could go and turn the light off herself, Jane thought. Over the past few days, her parents had become stiflingly possessive, and the approach of Christmas had only worsened the state of affairs. She would provoke another round of timorous attention if she disturbed their chat. Jane thrust a foot into the cold air, shivered, and changed her mind. Let her parents do it. The downstairs fire had gone out during the night, and the threadbare carpet left ample room for splinters to stab into bare feet. "Mom," Jane yelled. She was taking an uncommonly long time to answer. "Mom," Jane screamed. This was ridiculous. Her parents were adults. At least one of them should be up. It was Christmas Eve. Even as Jane thought that the light got brighter. "Dad?" Jane asked. Jane rose, shivering when the cold air touched her. The light in the room was increasing. Jane's family lived on a residential plot. The housing association made sure that the pavements were clean and illuminated. Still, their house was set back from the road, and the artificial orange glow seeping through the two-toned curtains could not explain the pale radiance that burned around her. The floor was chilly against her feet. On its smooth surface, a shadow rose. Twisted and distorted, it lurched towards her, inhuman, impossible. Then, it resolved into a person. "Oh," Jane exclaimed. The fear, which had momentarily cleared Jane's senses, evaporated. The dull throb settled back into her skull. Groaning, she dropped onto the edge of her bed. "What are you doing here?" Jane asked. Ginny smiled her familiar lopsided smile. "Not much," she said. Jane rolled over onto her side. Ginny's long auburn hair was loose. Jane felt the familiar tug of pride and envy that always accompanied Ginny's presence. Jane's red hair was always a mess. On the other hand, Ginny looked like a runway model the moment she rolled out of bed. Trust nature to cast her big sister as the beauty and Jane as the beast. It was hard to understand how the same combination of genetics had created two such utterly different beings. This wasn't the first time Jane had woken in the early hours to find Ginny in her bedroom. Ginny said that her internal clock was broken. Insomnia was her curse. It happened when she was stressed. It happened when she stayed up writing. Most often, it happened on Christmas Eve. Tonight, Jane wasn't in the mood. Why couldn't Ginny act her age and roll out of bed when their parents demanded it? Right? Like that's going to happen. Jane doubted her sister would ever grow out of her childish exuberance. Ginny and Christmas went together like tinsel and turkey. Try to swallow them both, and you'll choke. "Sorry, I couldn't sleep," Ginny said. "And you couldn't be an insomniac in your own room," Jane retorted. "You have the best view from your window." "I'm watching," Ginny said. "Whatever. You want a hug?" Jane was surprised to hear herself make the offer. She opened her arms, expecting that Ginny would already be there. That was another thing about her sister. Ginny was always hungry for affection. "I can't," Ginny said. "What, are you afraid of my BO?" Jane inquired. In the blistering brilliance that surrounded them, Ginny's smile was sad. "Always," Ginny joked. "So, what are you watching?" Jane asked. "Them out there," Ginny answered. "Oh, right. Them. You realize you're completely insane?" Jane teased. Ginny's grin widened, losing some of its melancholy. "But, of course," Ginny said. "So, who is them?" Jane asked. "People. Living, dying, loving. Celebrating," Ginny said. "Are they doing anything interesting?" Jane inquired. "It's terrible and wonderful," Ginny answered. Suddenly, Jane was worried. There was something in her sister's face that should not have been there. A deep sorrow. Sorrow had no connection to Ginny. The girl was a walking smile. Jane thought of getting up and sitting next to Ginny. She could tease her out of her mood. On the few occasions when Ginny had been low, Jane had been the only one who could reach her. She thought about it, but then her fatigue swelled higher, almost throttling her. "Look, Ginny, could we talk about this tomorrow?" Jane asked. "Sick of me already?" asked Ginny. It had started snowing outside. In the golden glow, the shadows of snowflakes looked like tear tracks on Ginny's face. Jane didn't answer. "I'll go in a minute, okay? I need to tell you something. I know you hate the soppy stuff, so I'll keep it short, but I love you, Ginny said. Jane imitated a puking sound. Ginny laughed. I know, I say that all the time, but it's Christmas, and I need you to know that they aren't just words. I really mean it. I want you to know how proud I am of you, of the person you are. You are strong, so much stronger than I ever was, Ginny told her. Jane felt a suspicious heat climb into her cheeks. Whatever, Jane responded. Listen, you have to help Mom and Dad. They're trying not to show how much they need you, but they're hurting and fragile. I'm trusting you to keep an eye on them, Ginny said. Jane rolled her eyes. Bored now, she said. Promise me, Ginny urged. Jane sighed. Her head lolled to one side. The light was overwhelming. Fine, I promise, Jane said. Footsteps moved to the door. It opened. I'll go see Mom and Dad before I turn in, Ginny said. Okay, Jane responded. Ginny sounded like she was smiling. Night, arse brain, Ginny teased. Night, arse face, Jane responded. That was the last thing Jane said, but as she toppled into sleep, she heard her sister murmur, Merry Christmas. Chapter 7. Christmas Day dawned in a sparkling bound. It had snowed overnight, but the clouds had exhausted themselves sometime in the early hours. As the temperature dropped below freezing, a tentative sun emerged to glitter on the hills. Jane opened her eyes at 6:30, and for a moment, she didn't remember anything. It was bliss. Last night's cold must have been easily defeated. Apart from the slightest headache, Jane felt fine. The tangled mess of her sheets enthroned her in warmth. The lights on her miniature Christmas tree shone like stars. Part of her contentment eroded when she heard movement in the hall. Her parents peering in across the door jamb filled in part of the puzzle. Hi, her dad said. He hadn't shaved. In his blue dressing gown, with his mustache in need of trimming, he looked like a graying, slightly bewildered bear. Her mother, in her best bathrobe and slippers, waited half a step behind him. Good morning, Jane dear. How are you feeling? Jane's mom said. Good, actually. Her parents winced when she spoke. Jane felt a pang of guilt. Had she really been that hard on them? Of course you have. You missed your sister's funeral, and they're still here checking on you. You're damn lucky they haven't disowned you, she thought. Really good, she spoke. Well, that's nice, he paused. Listen, we've got some presents downstairs. We'll understand if you don't feel like opening them, but it is Christmas. Ginny wouldn't have wanted us to miss out, Jane's dad said. Ginny? Jane frowned, looking at the window. Where is she? Her mother blanched. You know that, my darling, she said. Don't you want to wake her up, too? Jane responded. That's enough, Jane's father barked. Jane flinched, confused. She had never heard him so angry before. But what had she done? Don't, Bertram, Jane's mother said. She just woke up. She's confused. She drew in a shaky breath. Jane, your sister is in Green Lawn Cemetery. We buried her yesterday, remember? No, that can't be right. Ginny was standing right here. She came in to talk to me. Jane thought. Oh God, she said. Jane's hands leapt up to her mouth. They must have obstructed the flow of air because suddenly she was suffocating. Stupid. How could she have done it? How could she have overlooked a miracle? Ginny had been here in this room. Somehow, she had returned to the world, and Jane had sent her away because she was tired. Baby, her mother's dark hair was falling into her eyes. Are you all right? No, Jane wanted to say. No, she wasn't all right. Nothing would be all right ever again. She started to tell her parents that. To demand that they go away. She didn't want to see anybody, especially them. Before she could, Ginny spoke in her mind. The memory was so accurate that Jane jumped, half convinced that her sister was whispering in her ear. I need you to look after Mom and Dad. Remember that I love you, Ginny had said. Jane closed her eyes. She had already made a terrible mistake in the last 24 hours. She had missed an opportunity that would never return, and she'd done it by pushing love away. Was she foolish enough to do the same thing again? I'm sorry. I was confused. Of course, I remember. I'm so sorry. I wasn't able to be there, Jane said. After a moment, Jane's father relaxed. That's okay, sweetheart. I understand. We've all been a little tired. Jane's mom smiled at him and squeezed his hand. Jane's heart ached when she saw the love between them. So, do you want to see what Father Christmas left you? Her parents watched her expectantly. Well, Jane's dad asked. I don't really feel Christmassy, Jane began. Her parents sagged. But I'm getting there, she quickly added. Then, presents? Her mother asked. Jane nodded. Yes, please. Something throbbed in her chest. A sharp, deep-seated pain. She had been angry at her parents, Jane realized. Angry because they had let her sister die. Angry that they could bear it. Angry that they mourned and did not see that she was grieving too. Now, she could only feel how lucky she was to have them. Great, her father beamed. Your mom and I will just get dressed, and then we can make a start. Santa's been busy. I know, Jane thought. Jane was unprepared to accept that a man with a red suit and a begging bowl had orchestrated her sister's return from beyond the grave. Still, at the very least, she had to accept that the bedraggled Santa had been no ordinary man. What was that line from the Bible about entertaining angels unawares? How many angels, she wondered, hid behind red suits this time of year? Somehow, the man had given her the one gift that could heal her broken heart. Looking at her bedside table, Jane saw that the Santa brooch was gone. She climbed out of bed and padded to the window. Sunlight poured unfettered into the room. The curtains were open. Someone must have opened them while she slept. Merry Christmas, Jane thought, knowing that she was not bidding her sister goodbye forever. Knowing that, from somewhere in a bright corner of the universe, Ginny heard her. Merry Christmas, Ginny. I love you, Jane whispered. And somehow, that was enough. Thank you for joining me in this spooky Christmas story. What do you think of Jane's experience? Was she dreaming, hallucinating through fever? Or did the man dressed as Santa Claus really give her one last conversation with her departed sister? What about you? Have you ever experienced a Christmas ghost of your own? What is your favorite Christmas ghost story? What was the first story you ever heard? Let me know your answers and anything else you like in the comments. For now, I'd better say goodbye. I have a few more gifts to wrap. I would like to take this opportunity to wish you the merriest of Merry Christmases, full of love, kindness, and only the friendliest of ghosts. Thank you for being my friends and making this Christmas so very, very special.